What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Week 3, it's right around the corner, so you know what that means. We have to give you guys our top 36 rankings at the wide receiver position today. Running backs coming later this afternoon as well, per usual. But that being said, I don't want to waste anybody's time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. So as you can see, I have the tier maker pulled up on the screen right now. There are 7 tiers as usual that we are going to be getting through today. To get through all 36 players, I want to start off at the top, and we are going to be starting at my number 1 player. That player is going to be CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, as always, tier 1 is going to be those elite wide receiver ones. So you can look at these guys as the elite wide receiver ones. CeeDee plays in a game against Baltimore this week, and last week he caught 4 of 7 targets for 90 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's loss to the Saints. This matchup against Baltimore, it should be a good one for Lamb. Baltimore currently ranks 27th against fantasy wide receivers, so I expect Lamb to continue to produce for us for fantasy football. Now, moving on to my number 2 guy, we are going to have Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. He plays against the Washington Commanders, and Chase was limited to just 4 receptions on 5 targets for 35 yards in Sunday's 26-25 loss to the Chiefs. Now, this certainly hasn't been the start that you've wanted from Jamar Chase so far if you did draft him early in your fantasy football drafts, but this week's matchup against the Washington Commanders, it's exactly what we need. Washington is dead last against fantasy football wide receivers, so if Chase wants to go out there, put out a big week this week, this is the perfect time to do it. He's coming in as my number 2 wide receiver. Now, coming in at 3, it is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. He plays on the road at the Arizona Cardinals, and after a quiet week 1, St. Brown, he bounced back in week 2 with 11 catches for 119 yards on 19 targets versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He did get a little bit banged up in this game, but Coach Dan Campbell, he did say that he is going to be good to go here for week 3, and St. Brown is still seeing a 30.9% target share through 2 weeks. So going on to number 4, it is going to be Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. He plays against the Houston Texans, and through 2 games this season, including his early exit on Sunday this week, Jefferson has piled up 8 catches for 192 yards and 2 scores on 13 targets. So this is kind of shut down any concerns that you've had about the ability for Justin Jefferson to produce at a high level with Sam Darnold under center. Now, he did get a little bit banged up in this week, like I mentioned, but the assumption is that he is going to be good to go, and if so, we're going to be firing him up per usual. Now, moving on to tier 2. Tier 2 is going to be those high-end wide receiver ones, and coming in as my wide receiver 5, it is going to be Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. He plays on the road at the Minnesota Vikings, and Collins, he caught 8 of 10 targets for 135 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's win over the Bears. He's easily led this team in receiving yards once again, finishing with 98 more yards than second place Stephon Diggs after topping second place Tank Dell by 77 receiving yards in week 1. So he's the clear number 1 wide receiver here for CJ Stroud. This matchup with the Minnesota Vikings this week should have a lot of points, and Nico should continue to be a set it and forget it wide receiver 1. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 6, this is where I'm going to have Rashee of the Kansas City Chiefs. He plays on the road at the Atlanta Falcons, and he caught 5 of 6 targets for 75 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's win over the Bengals. Rice now has 2 top 20 finishes in back-to-back weeks and is commanding a 31.3% target share in this Chiefs offense. I'm expecting a little bit more of the same here in week 3 versus Atlanta, despite it being a little bit of a tougher matchup here on paper. Let's move on to my number 7 wide receiver. It is going to be Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. He plays against the New England Patriots here this week, and he caught 4 of 6 targets for 57 yards and added a 5-yard run in Sunday's 24-17 win over the Titans. It's now been 2 weeks straight where Wilson has failed to crack the top 24 on the week, but the usage is there. Wilson has a 29% target share with a decent matchup against the New England Patriots. However, New England has done a great job kind of keeping opposing teams from scoring a lot of points so far this year, so there is a little risk. But like I said, the usage is there for Wilson, and a big week is coming. It's just a matter of if it's going to happen this week. Now, moving on to my number 8 overall wide receiver, it is going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. He plays against the Detroit Lions, and Harrison turned 4 receptions and 8 targets into 130 yards and 2 touchdowns in Sunday's blowout win over the Rams. Harrison went from the wide receiver 106 in week 1 to the wide receiver 1 overall in week 2. So the chatter last week about Marvin and Kyler, it's turned into production on the field, and this week's matchup against Detroit should be high scoring as well. Now, moving on to my number 9 wide receiver, it is going to be Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. He plays against the Philadelphia Eagles, and Olave caught 4 of 6 targets for 81 yards in Sunday's 44-19 win over the Dallas Cowboys. Olave was 1 yard away from a much bigger stat line here in week 2, and this week's matchup against Philly should leave potential for a shootout here for fantasy football. Olave has big playability, and he could have a good week here against the Eagles. Now, let's move on to my tier 3. My tier tier 3 is going to be those low-end wide receiver ones for your fantasy football teams. Coming in at number 10, it is going to be Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He plays against the Denver Broncos this week, and he caught 3 of 6 targets for 42 yards in Sunday's 20-16 win over the Lions. Now, this matchup for Evans, it's going to be tough. Denver's currently ranked first against fantasy football wide receivers, and normally we wouldn't put too much stock into that just because it's only been about 2 weeks, but we've also talked about Pat Surtain on this channel over the last few weeks as well. I expect Evans to see his fair share of shadow coverage in this one, and so because of that, he's probably going to be a low-end wide receiver 1. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 11, it is going to be Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. They play against the Carolina Panthers, and Adams brought in 9 of 12 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown in the Raiders' 26-23 win over the Ravens on Sunday. Adams now has 18 targets through 2 games, which is an encouraging development for the chemistry with Gardner Minshew heading into a favorable Week 3 matchup against the Carolina Panthers. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 12, I am going to put Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers there. He plays a game on the road at the Los Angeles Rams, and Aiyuk had 4 receptions on 5 targets for 43 yards in Sunday's 23-17 loss to the Minnesota Vikings. Going into Week 3, it's up to George Kittle, Brandon Aiyuk, and Jordan Mason to carry this offense, with CMC and Deebo Samuel now expected to miss extended time. The slow start from Aiyuk after holding out all summer, it needs to end now for San Francisco, and he should have a great chance to get on track here against a banged-up Rams team. And moving on to my wide receiver 13, this is where I'm going to put DeVonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. He plays on the road at the New Orleans Saints, and Smith recorded 7 catches on 10 targets for 76 yards and a touchdown in Monday's 22-21 loss to the Falcons. With A.J. Brown expected to miss more time here in Week 3, DeVonta is going to continue operating as this team's wide receiver 1. Even with A.J. Brown on the field in Week 1, Smith currently has a 31% target share in this Philly Eagles offense. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 14, this is where I'm going to have Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. He plays against the Seattle Seahawks on the road there in Seattle, and Hill secured 6 of 3 targets for 24 yards and rushed once for 12 yards in this Dolphins 31-10 loss to the Bills on Thursday night. Hill and Jalen Waddle both took an early seat in the 4th quarter, and neither of them saw a target after Skylar Thompson replaced Tua Tagovailoa. But that's going to have to change here if Miami wants to be competitive in this matchup this week against Seattle. But because of Skylar Thompson under center, we are going to be fading Tyreek Hill down our rankings here this week. Now, moving on to my tier 4 here, we are going to have the high-end wide receiver 2s, and coming in as my wide receiver 15, that is going to be Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Bucks. Now, he plays against the Denver Broncos, as I mentioned. Godwin, he caught 7 of 8 targets for 117 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's win over the Lions, and he accounted for Baker Mayfield's first 7 completions, including a 41-yard touchdown catch. Now, with Mike Evans possibly seeing the majority of Surtain in this matchup, I do expect Godwin to continue eating underneath. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 16 here, this is where I'm going to have Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. He plays on the road at the Dallas Cowboys, and Flowers brought in 7 of 11 targets for 91 yards and a touchdown in the Ravens' shocking loss to the Raiders here on Sunday. He had a 29.6% target share through the first 2 games, with both Andrews and Likely on the field, and this is a very positive sign in the second-year leap for Flowers. Now, he should continue to have some PPR appeal, even if he doesn't profile as the best red zone option. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 17, this is where I'm going to have DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, and he plays on the road at the Indianapolis Colts. Moore finished with 6 receptions on 10 targets for 53 yards in Sunday's 19-13 loss to the Houston Texans. He continues to be rookie quarterback Caleb Williams' favorite target through 2 games this season, and the volume has helped offset the lack of touchdowns. Now, hopefully, the Bears, they can show some signs of life here this week against the Indianapolis Colts team that has let up quite a bit of points to the fantasy football wide receiver position. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 18, this is where I'm going to put Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. He plays on the road at the Cleveland Browns, and Nabers caught 10 of 18 targets for 127 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 21-18 loss to the Commanders. Nabers has certainly passed the eye test up to this point in his young career, but he will face a much tougher test here in Week 3 against a Browns dingy secondary. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 19, this is where I'm going to have Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. He plays on the road against the Arizona Cardinals, like I mentioned. Williams, he's caught 5 of 11 targets for 79 yards in Sunday's 20-16 loss to the Buccaneers, and now has 20 targets through 2 games for the Lions. He was overshadowed a little bit last week by Amon-Ra St. Brown's 19 targets. He should continue stretching the field for Detroit, and with his elite speed in Week 3 against the Cardinals, there is a chance for some big points. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 20, this is where I'm going to put DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Like I said, they play against the Miami Dolphins. Metcalf, he recorded 10 receptions on 14 targets for 121 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 23-20 overtime win over the New England Patriots. Now, week 2, it was a positive sign for the Ryan Grubb offense after we saw both DK Metcalf and JSN perform at a high level, resulting in DK finishing as the wide receiver 2 overall on the week. This week's matchup versus Miami will be an interesting one because, as I've mentioned, Miami is going to be without starting quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, so there is a chance that this game gets out of hand pretty quickly. And now the final player here in this tier 4, it is going to be Drake London, who comes in as my wide receiver 21. He plays against the Kansas City Chiefs, and London brought in 6 of 7 targets for 54 yards and a touchdown in the Falcons' 22-21 win over the Eagles on Monday night. Although London's week 3 matchup against the Chiefs does mean coverage from Trent McDuffie, there should still be plenty of opportunities for London to produce as the Falcons try and remain aggressive through the air. Now, moving on to my tier 5. Tier 5 is what we're going to call those low-end wide receiver 2s. Coming in as my wide receiver 22, I have Michael Pittman Jr. of the Colts. He plays against the Chicago Bears, and Pittman brought in 3 of 7 targets for 21 yards in the Colts' 16-10 loss to the Packers on Sunday. Pittman, he's getting the volume that we want, but with just 52 total yards in his first 2 games, it makes me worry about the role that he's playing here in this offense and how it's not contributing to fantasy football points. Plus, this week's matchup is a little bit tougher against a good Chicago Bears secondary, where he's likely going to be covered by Jalen Johnson for the majority of the night. Now, let's move on to my wide receiver 23. Wide receiver 23 is where I'm going to have Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. He plays on the road at the Minnesota Vikings, so he gets a little bit of a reunion back there in Minnesota, or maybe a revenge game there in Minnesota. He caught 4 of 6 targets for 37 yards in Sunday's 19-13 win over the Bears. Diggs may have not gotten the touchdowns in week 2 that he got in week 1, but he still saw 80% of the snaps and is working underneath in one of the best offenses here in football. He will have his ups and downs in this offense, but he should remain a boom-bust option for us here in our fantasy football lineups. Now, coming in at wide receiver 24, this is where I'm going to put Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. He plays against the New York Giants, and Cooper recorded 3 receptions on 8 targets for 11 yards in Sunday's 18-13 win over the Jaguars. This is somewhat concerning for Cooper and the Browns, who both haven't really looked the same this year. This week's matchup against New York should be a chance for them to finally get it back together because the New York defense just isn't that great. But if they don't, this is a major sign that it just might not happen this year, and it does make me worried about Amari Cooper. But he is my wide receiver 24 here this week. Now, let's move on to the last player in this tier 5. It is going to be Jalen Waddle, who comes in as my wide receiver 25 here. He plays against the Seattle Seahawks here on the road, and Waddle brought in all 4 of his targets for 41 yards and rushed once for 4 yards in the Dolphins' 31-10 loss to the Bills on Thursday night. Through 2 weeks, Waddle only has a 12% target share, and the quality of targets are expected to come down drastically with Skylar Thompson under center here for Miami. That said, Waddle still has some home run ability and he can still be started, but he's definitely going to be a high-risk, high-reward type of player. Now, moving on to my tier 6 here, this is what we're going to call high-end wide receiver 3s, and coming in as my wide receiver 26, it's going to be Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. As I mentioned, they play the Minnesota Vikings on the road this week, and Dell, he caught 1 of 4 targets for -3 yards, and he rushed 3 times for 16 yards in Sunday's 19-13 win over the Bears. Now, Dell, he's kind of struggled to score fantasy points for us in a crowded Texans wide receiver room that definitely views Nico Collins as their number 1 option, but this offense still passes the ball enough to give Dell a 17% target share through the first 2 weeks, but Dell will continue to be inconsistent for fantasy football teams as long as Collins and Diggs are both healthy. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 27, this is going to be George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He plays against the Los Angeles Chargers, and Pickens recorded 2 receptions on 4 targets for 29 yards in Sunday's 13-6 win over the Denver Broncos. Pickens, he does look like the real deal as this team's wide receiver 1. However, Justin Fields isn't really throwing a ton of yards, and the Steelers just aren't scoring that many touchdowns on offense. This is capping Pickens' ceiling for fantasy football, and in a low-scoring matchup against the Chargers this week, we may need to temper our expectations for George Pickens. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 28, I am going to have Rashee Shaheed for the New Orleans Saints. He plays against the Philadelphia Eagles, and Shaheed, he caught all 4 of his targets for 96 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 44-19 win over the Cowboys. He added 13 rushing yards on 3 carries, and Shaheed has been one of the bigger surprises at the start of the year, finishing as a top 15 wide receiver in both games to start the season. The majority of the reasoning behind that is because of the long touchdowns that he had in both weeks, but it looks like it's going to be a part of the game plan here for the New Orleans Saints this year. Shaheed is a big play waiting to happen, and he should be in fantasy football lineups as long as Derek Carr keeps playing lights out. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 29, this is where I'm going to have Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. He plays against the Atlanta Falcons on the road. Worthy, he caught 2 of 4 targets for 17 yards, and he added a 5-yard run in Sunday's 26-25 win over the Bengals. Now, the Kansas City Chiefs, they did lose Isaiah Pacheco, meaning they might tend to go a little bit more to a pass-heavy offense. Week 1 and Week 2 were very different outcomes for Worthy, mainly due to the touchdowns not being there in Week 2. However, he can still house it anytime he touches the ball, and he should still be a decent play here against the Atlanta Falcons. And the last player in this Tier 6 is going to be Brian Thomas Jr., coming in as my wide receiver 30. Now, he plays on the road at the Buffalo Bills, and Thomas recorded 2 receptions on 4 targets for 94 yards in Sunday's 18-13 loss to the Browns. Now, Thomas has been a top 30 fantasy football wide receiver in both of his first 2 starts in the NFL, and these are positive signs for the rookie, so I expect him to continue building upon that start, even though this is going to be a tough Buffalo defense who has been stingy to fantasy football wide receivers already this year. And now moving on to my Tier 7, these are your low-end wide receiver 3s. We're going to talk about wide receiver 31. This is Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. He plays against the Green Bay Packers here this week, and Ridley brought in 4 of 6 targets for 77 yards and a touchdown. He also rushed once for 10 yards and another score on the ground in the Titans' 24-17 loss to the Jets on Sunday. Now, Ridley had a great game last week, and that's kind of the ceiling that we want to see out of Calvin Ridley on a consistent basis, but Will Levis is still going to continue to be the inconsistent factor here in Tennessee, and this game is projected to be one of the lowest scoring games of the week. Obviously, you like what you saw out of Ridley last week, but I wouldn't be chasing the same result from Ridley here in Week 3. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 32, this is where I'm going to have Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. He plays against the Miami Dolphins, and JSN, he recorded 12 receptions on 16 targets for 117 yards in Sunday's 23-20 overtime win over the Patriots. Week 1, it kind of had me worried for JSN, but in Week 2, he pulled in a 37% target share, and he finished as a top 10 wide receiver on the week. Now, let's hope the Seahawks realize that JSN is one of their most talented playmakers, and they continue to feed him the ball here in Week 3. Now, coming into my wide receiver 33, this is where I'm going to have Demarcus Robinson of the Los Angeles Rams. He plays against the San Francisco 49ers, and Robinson had 2 receptions on 4 targets for 50 yards in Sunday's 41-10 loss to the Cardinals. Now, this Rams offense, it looks to be in major trouble, but with Kupp and Nakua both expected to miss time here, Robinson has kind of found himself as Stafford's wide receiver 1 for at least the next month or so. San Francisco is currently ranked 30th against fantasy football wide receivers, and Los Angeles should have to pass a lot to keep up here in this one. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 34, this is where I'm going to put Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. He plays on the road at the Cincinnati Bengals, and as I've expressed multiple times in multiple videos this week, I am very concerned about Terry McLaurin, but he did catch 6 of 8 targets for 22 yards in Sunday's 21-18 win over the Giants. Now, McLaurin, he just hasn't been giving us the production that we've been looking for at the start of the season, despite seeing a 22.6% target share. Now, there just isn't much volume in this passing offense, and they're not really taking a lot of downfield shots in this offense. That being said, McLaurin, he's going to eventually have a big day. It's inevitable, but it feels like he is a super risky play here at this point. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 35, this is where I'm going to have Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. He plays against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Shakir secured all 5 targets for 54 yards and rushed once for 2 yards in the Bills' 31-10 win over the Dolphins on Thursday night. Through 2 games now, Shakir looks like Josh Allen's favorite target. He posted wide receiver 3 or better numbers in both weeks, and I expect Allen to keep leaning on Shakir, especially in games where it's a little bit more competitive than it was against Miami here in Week 2. And last but not least, coming in as my wide receiver 36, this is where I'm going to put Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. He plays on the road at the Tennessee Titans, and Reed secured both targets for 9 yards. He rushed twice for 37 yards in the Packers' 16-10 win over the Colts on Sunday. And after finishing as the wide receiver 1 overall in Week 1, Reed finished as the wide receiver 48 in Week 2. This ranking is projecting Malik Willis at quarterback again here in Week 3. Now, there are rumblings that Jordan Love might come back. If he is under center, I will be moving Reed up in my rankings. But for now, with Malik Willis projected to be under center here in Week 3, Jaden Reed comes in as a flex play and my wide receiver 36 overall. So there you have it. That's my top 36 wide receivers here in Week 3. If you did enjoy the video, go ahead and hit that like button for me. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you guys go hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. That way you do not miss the running back episode that is going to be coming out here in a couple of hours. As always, if you have any additional questions, you can find me in my Discord. I do have a free Discord linked in the description. As I mentioned, it's free to join, so there is no risk in doing that. I'm in there helping you guys 24/7, 365, Dynasty, Redraft, whatever you got fantasy football-wise, that's where you can find me. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.